Josie Lane was 18 years old and alone in the high desert, cast out by the only family she had left, with just $20 in a worn cloth pouch. She took the one thing no one else in the dusty outpost of Saltwash would touch: the cursed homestead out on Jasper Creek. They said the place was poison, a patch of ground that swallowed hope and left only bleached bones. But what nobody knew was that beneath a loose hearthstone lay a small savings tin and a letter from a woman who had been waiting decades to speak. That letter, and the treasure it protected, would change Josie's life forever. Settle in close, friends, and if you would, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. This is a story about the foundations we build when all others have crumbled. Josie's world had been built and unbuilt by men who worked with their hands. Her father, Thomas Lane, was a carpenter, a man who spoke more fluently through the language of wood grain and the precise bite of a sharp blade than he ever did with words. He smelled of pine sap and linseed oil, and his hands, though calloused and scarred, were gentle. From the time she was old enough to stand on a stool beside his workbench, he had taught her. He didn't offer lessons in the way a schoolteacher might, with charts and recitations. He simply worked, and he let her watch, and when she was ready, he let her help. He taught her how to read the tension in a piece of timber, how to drive a nail in 3 clean strokes, how to sharpen a saw until its teeth whispered through oak. The first tool he ever let her use on her own was a small dovetail saw, its brass spine heavy, and its applewood handle worn to a silken patina by his grip. He had placed it in her small hands and said, "A straight cut is an honest cut, Josie. Remember that." That saw, light and perfectly balanced, became her most treasured possession, a tangible piece of his quiet, steady love. Her mother, Eleanor, had a different kind of knowledge. She knew the desert, its secret language of herbs and roots. She taught Josie which plants could soothe a fever, which could be pounded into a poultice for a wound, and which, when steeped in hot water, made a tea that could settle a worried mind. While Thomas built walls to keep the world out, Eleanor showed her how to find sustenance and healing within it. Their life was a small, tightly woven thing, held together by the rhythms of work and the vast, silent presence of the desert sky. But when Josie was 12, a fever swept through their small settlement, a dry, burning sickness that respected neither strong walls nor healing herbs. It took her mother first, quietly in the night. It took her father a week later, his big hands, for the first time, lying still upon the quilt. She was left with the dovetail saw, a book of pressed plants, and an ache so vast it felt like a hollow space inside her ribs. Her father's brother, Silas, took her in. Silas was a different kind of man entirely. Where Thomas had seen the soul of a thing, Silas saw only its use and its price. He ran a small freight business, and he viewed Josie as another piece of inventory, useful for mending harnesses and keeping his dusty ledgers, but ultimately a cost. He was not a cruel man in the way of loud words or a heavy hand, but his practicality was a cold, constant pressure. He never spoke of her parents, never acknowledged the anniversary of their passing. He provided food and a roof, and in his mind, that settled the account. For 6 years, Josie lived in his house, a quiet shadow, moving through the rooms. She did her work without complaint, her stitches on the thick leather of a horse collar, as neat and true as the dovetail joints her father had taught her to cut. She grew into a young woman who was observant and self-reliant, her grief buried deep beneath a surface of quiet competence. Silas saw her silence not as strength, but as a lack of spirit, a meekness that confirmed his assessment of her as a dependent. He never once saw the steel in her spine, forged in the quiet hours at her father's workbench. The end of her time in Silas's house came as quietly as it had begun. He had been making trips to a larger town to the east, and one day he returned with a woman in his wagon, a widow named Martha, with 2 young sons of her own. The ejection was not a dramatic confrontation. It was a simple, administrative decree, delivered over a supper of beans and salt pork. The air was thick with the unspoken. Martha's boys, loud and restless, had already filled the small house with a chaotic energy that left no room for a quiet niece. Silas cleared his throat, not looking at Josie, but at a spot on the wall just over her head. "Martha and I are to be married," he said, his voice flat. "Her brother is buying the freight business. We'll be moving east to join his enterprise." He paused, taking a long drink of water. "There isn't room for you in the new arrangement." The words were as plain and unadorned as fence posts. There was no apology, no softness. It was a calculation. An asset had become a liability. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small cloth pouch, placing it on the table beside her plate. "This is $20. It's the last of what I calculate for your work these past years. You should be gone by morning." Josie looked at him, at this man who shared her father's blood, but none of his heart. She saw no malice in his eyes, only a weary finality. Arguing would be as useless as arguing with the tide. She simply nodded, her throat too tight to form words. She did not cry. She did not beg. She picked up the pouch of coins, the weight of it both a pittance and a fortune, and rose from the table. "Thank you for the suppers," she said, her voice even. That night, she packed. It did not take long. She wrapped the dovetail saw in an old piece of oilcloth and placed it at the bottom of a burlap sack. On top went her mother's book of herbs, a single change of clothes, a mended wool blanket, and a small tin of matches. She stood at the window of her small room, looking out at the vast, star-dusted darkness of the desert. She was 18 years old, and for the second time in her life, she was utterly alone. She had $20, a few meager possessions, and the memory of a father who taught her that a straight cut was an honest cut. It would have to be enough. At first light, before the sun had crested the jagged line of the eastern mesas, Josie Lane walked away from her uncle's house without a backward glance. The air was cool and carried the sharp, clean scent of creosote bush. Her footsteps were the only sound in the pre-dawn stillness, a soft crunching on the gravelly earth. She walked toward the small cluster of buildings that made up the town of Saltwash, a place that had been the entire map of her world for 6 years. By the time the sun was fully up, casting long, distorted shadows across the desert floor, she had already begun to understand the new shape of her life. She went first to the mercantile, run by a stern, hawk-nosed woman named Mrs. Gable. Josie asked if she needed any help sweeping or stocking shelves. Mrs. Gable looked her up and down, her eyes lingering on the burlap sack. "Silas has sold up," she said. It wasn't a question. News in a town like Saltwash traveled faster than a brush fire. "We've got no paid work." The dismissal was polite, but firm. At the livery stable, the owner, a man named Henderson, barely looked up from the hoof he was shoeing. "Got a boy already?" he grunted, the clang of his hammer against the anvil echoing the closing of a door. She tried the small boarding house, thinking perhaps she could work for a room, but the woman there just shook her head, a flicker of pity in her eyes that was somehow worse than the outright rejection. In the space of a single morning, Josie became a ghost in her own town. The people she had seen every week for years now looked through her. They knew Silas had cast her off, and in their rigid, unforgiving world, an unattached young woman, with no family and no prospects, was a problem, a loose thread that might unravel the tightly woven fabric of their community. She was no longer Josie Lane, the carpenter's daughter. She was just a girl with a sack, a stray to be shooed away. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the dusty street, and the heat became a physical weight. Josie bought a small loaf of bread and a canteen of water from Mrs. Gable, the coins from her pouch feeling impossibly light in her hand. She sat in the sliver of shade offered by the town's water tower and ate slowly, forcing herself to chew each mouthful. It was then that she heard the men talking. They were teamsters, lounging near the livery, their voices lazy in the afternoon heat. "Heard Silas Lane finally unloaded that niece of his," one said. "About time," another replied. "Never knew what to make of that one." Quiet as a stone. Then a third man spoke, and his words snagged her attention. "Wonder where she'll go. Only place left for someone with nothing is the old Vargas homestead." A low chuckle ran through the group. "Might as well go dig your own grave. That place is cursed. Creek went dry, and they all died of thirst, right in their beds." The story was a piece of local lore, a ghost story told to frighten children. But to Josie, it sounded like a direction, a place, a name. She finished her bread, tightened the strap of her sack, and walked back to the mercantile. Mrs. Gable was polishing the glass on her counter. "The Vargas homestead," Josie said, her voice clear. "Where is it?" Mrs. Gable stopped her polishing and looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time that day. "Child, you don't want to go out there. It's nothing but ruin and bad memories." "Is it on anyone's claim?" Josie asked, ignoring the warning. "No. It's been abandoned for 30 years. County land now. Anyone can file a claim on it, but no one's ever been fool enough to try." Josie slid a silver dollar across the counter. "How much is the filing fee?" The older woman stared at the coin, then at Josie's determined face. A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Mrs. Gable sighed. $20, she said softly. "It would take everything you have." Josie met her gaze without flinching. "I know." She pushed the rest of the coins from her pouch onto the counter. Her entire inheritance. Her journey now had a destination. It was a 3-mile walk out of town, following the faint tracks of a long-forgotten wagon road that led toward a low, flat-topped mesa. The sun was relentless, the landscape shimmered with heat, the distant mountains wavering like a dream. The silence of the desert pressed in, broken only by the buzz of insects and the cry of a lone hawk circling high above. With every step, she left the world that had rejected her further behind. And with every step, the weight of her sack seemed to grow, not with its meager contents, but with the terrifying, absolute finality of her choice. She was walking toward a curse, because it was the only place left that might have her. The homestead was less a building and more a scar on the land, a testament to a long-surrendered fight against the elements. It was tucked into a shallow curve at the base of the Jasper Creek Mesa, a location chosen, she guessed, to shelter it from the worst of the wind and the sun. The walls were a mix of sun-dried adobe brick and dark, flat stones hauled from the creek bed. A porch had once run the length of the front, but its roof had long ago collapsed, its support posts askew like broken teeth. The single door hung from one remaining leather hinge, scarred and bleached by decades of sun. The 2 small windows were boarded over with weathered gray planks. Tumbleweeds, brittle and skeletal, were piled in drifts against the walls and choked the mouth of a stone-lined well a few yards from the door. This was the place they called cursed, the place where a family had supposedly withered away from thirst. But as Josie stood there, her sack at her feet, she saw something else. She saw the careful, patient work in the stone walls, the way each rock had been chosen and fitted against its neighbor. She saw the deep-set hearth, its massive stone lintel, still perfectly level. The roofline, though sagging in places, was built with thick, hand-hewn timbers that looked solid and true. It was a ruin, yes, but it had been built with skill. It had good bones. She pushed the groaning door open and stepped inside. The air was thick with the dust of ages, dry and smelling of decay and old nests. Sunlight filtered in through the cracks in the boarded windows, illuminating swirling motes of dust. The floor was packed earth, littered with debris and the droppings of small animals that had made the place their home. A simple plank table lay on its side, one leg broken, and a rusted iron cookstove stood cold in the corner. In the center of the single room was the great stone hearth, black with the soot of 1,000 long-extinguished fires. It was a desolate sight, enough to send anyone with another option running back to town. But Josie had no other option. This desolate shell was her only hope of shelter. She dropped her sack by the door and began to work. Her first task was to reclaim the space from the wilderness. She unboarded one of the windows, prying the old nails loose with the claw of a small hammer her father had made for her. Another treasure tucked in her sack. The wood was brittle and splintered, but it came away, and a rectangle of harsh afternoon light fell across the floor, banishing some of the gloom. She spent the rest of the day clearing the room, using a flat piece of the collapsed porch roof as a makeshift shovel. She hauled out mounds of dried leaves, old nests, and unidentifiable debris, piling it all a safe distance from the house. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and purple, the floor was clear. It was still just a dirt floor in a ruined house, but it was her dirt floor. As twilight deepened, a profound silence settled over the land. The desert, which had been so harsh and unforgiving by day, grew soft and mysterious. She built a small fire in the stone hearth, using dry brush she'd gathered. The flames flickered to life, the first warmth the house had known in 30 years. The light danced on the stone walls, making the small space feel less like a tomb and more like a refuge. She ate the last of her bread, drank from her canteen, and then wrapped herself in her wool blanket on the floor near the hearth. Sleep did not come easily. Every unfamiliar sound, the hoot of an owl, the distant yip of a coyote, the rustle of some small creature in the walls, made her start. She was utterly exposed, a solitary soul in an immense and indifferent wilderness. She clutched the handle of her father's saw through the burlap of her sack, the smooth wood, a familiar comfort in the overwhelming strangeness. She thought of the story the men told, of a family dying of thirst. She wondered if their ghosts still lingered here, but she felt no fear. Only a deep, bone-weary exhaustion, and a stubborn, flickering ember of determination. This place was cursed, they said. But for the first time since she had walked away from her uncle's house, she felt the faint stirring of something that resembled home. For 3 days, Josie worked from sunup to sundown, fueled by a grim resolve. Her first priority was water. The story of the family dying of thirst haunted her, a practical fear more potent than any ghost. The stone-lined well, near the house, was her only hope. It was choked with a generation's worth of dirt, rocks, and the tangled skeletons of countless tumbleweeds. She had no rope or bucket, so she began the back-breaking work of clearing it by hand, climbing down into the shaft as far as she dared, and hauling out debris in her burlap sack. The stones were slick with a damp, cool slime, and the air grew thick and earthy. After 2 days of this punishing labor, her hands raw and her muscles screaming in protest, she had cleared it to a depth of nearly 15 feet. It was there, at the bottom, that she found it, a thin, steady trickle of water seeping from between the rocks. It was not a gush, not a spring, but it was water, clear and cold. She sat at the edge of the well, her legs dangling into the cool darkness, and wept. They were not tears of sadness or self-pity, but of profound, overwhelming relief. The curse was a lie. The creek may have run dry, but the earth still held its water for those willing to dig for it. With the promise of water secured, she turned her full attention to the house itself. The hearth was its heart, and she decided to begin there. The floor in front of it was made of large, flat flagstones set into the packed earth. While sweeping away the last of the accumulated dust and grime, she noticed that one of the stones, a large gray slab right in the center, was not quite level with the others. It rocked, just slightly, when she put her weight on it. Curiosity piqued, she fetched her father's hammer and used the claw end to carefully pry at the edge of the stone. It resisted at first, sealed by years of impacted dirt, but with patient effort, it shifted, then lifted. Beneath it was a neatly excavated hollow, about 2 feet square, lined with a thick, well-preserved sheet of oilcloth, and nestled inside that hollow was a small, heavy tin box, the kind used for holding tea or tobacco. Its surface was dark with age, but free of rust. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She lifted the box out. It was heavier than it looked. With trembling fingers, she worked at the lid, which was sealed tight. It finally gave way with a soft sigh of released air. The contents were packed neatly inside. On top lay a small, carved wooden bird, its simple lines worn smooth. Beneath it was a stack of banknotes, worn and soft to the touch, held together by a piece of twine. And under the money, at the very bottom, was a letter, folded into a neat square and sealed with a drop of wax. She counted the money first, her practical nature taking precedence. There were banknotes and a small cloth bag heavy with silver coins. Altogether, it amounted to $320. It was not a king's ransom, But to a girl who had started the week with nothing, it was a staggering fortune. It was enough. Enough for tools, for supplies, for seeds. Enough for a new beginning. Then, she picked up the letter. The paper was yellowed and brittle at the creases. She broke the wax seal carefully and unfolded it. The handwriting inside was elegant and precise. The ink faded, but still perfectly legible. It began without preamble. To whoever finds this, if anyone ever does, my name is Esther Vargas. My husband, Mateo, and I built this house with our own hands in the year 1886. We cut the timbers from the high mesas and hauled the stone from Jasper Creek. We meant to fill it with children and laughter. But God had other plans. Mateo was killed in a rock slide at the silver mine 2 years after we finished the roof. He did not die of thirst here. That is a cruel story, told by foolish men. I lived on here alone for 27 years after he passed. I kept a garden and some goats, and I saved what little I could. This money is what I saved. It is not much, but it is honest money, earned with hard work and a lonely heart. I am an old woman now, and I am leaving this place to go to my sister in California. I do not have the strength for these winters anymore. I leave this house and this money, not to anyone in particular, but to the next person who comes to this place in need of a home. I pray you are strong enough to make a life here again. The world can be a hard place, but a good roof and a warm fire make it easier to bear. May this place be a blessing to you, as it was, for a time, to me. Esther Vargas, September 1915. Josie read the letter twice, then a third time, her vision blurring with tears. This woman, this stranger from another time, felt more like kin than her own uncle had ever been. Esther Vargas had known solitude. She had known loss. And she had known the profound comfort of a well-built wall and a fire in the hearth. The wooden bird, she now realized, must have been carved by Mateo. Josie sat on the dirt floor, the letter in one hand and the small bird in the other, and felt a connection that spanned the decades. She was not alone in this house. She was the inheritor of a quiet legacy of resilience. The curse was not just a lie. It was the opposite of the truth. This was not a place of death. It was a place of enduring hope, left behind by a woman who believed that someone else, someday, would be strong enough to build again. The discovery of Esther's cash changed everything. It was not just the money, though the $300 felt like an impossible treasure. It was the story, the quiet testament of a life lived with dignity in the face of loss. Josie was no longer a squatter in a ruin. She was a custodian, the chosen successor to a legacy of quiet strength. The very next morning, she walked the 3 miles back to Saltwash, no longer a supplicant but a customer. She walked into Mrs. Gable's mercantile with a straight back and a clear purpose. She laid a list on the counter: a new axe head, a shovel, 200 feet of good hemp rope, a bucket, nails in 3 sizes, a sack of lime for plaster, a pane of glass for the main window, and enough flour, salt pork, beans, and coffee to last a month. Mrs. Gable looked at the list, then at Josie, her eyebrows raised in disbelief. "This is a tall order," she said, her voice holding a note of suspicion. "I can pay," Josie said simply, and laid 2 $10 banknotes on the counter. The sight of the money silenced any further questions. An hour later, Finn, the young man who worked at the livery, was loading her supplies into a small buckboard wagon he'd been hired to drive out to the homestead. He was a lanky boy of about her age, with a shock of sandy hair and a shy, easy manner. He didn't ask where she'd gotten the money. He just loaded the sacks and tools with a quiet efficiency. "Heard you cleared the well," he said as they rode out of town. "Found water." The news had apparently already made its way through the Saltwash grapevine. Josie just nodded. The stories were wrong. The rebuilding began in earnest. With a proper rope and bucket, she finished clearing the well, hauling up bucket after bucket of mud and silt until the water at the bottom was deep enough to be drawn, and it ran clear and sweet. The taste of that first full dipper of cold, clean water was the taste of victory. Next, she tackled the walls. Following the memory of her father's lessons, she mixed adobe mud with straw and water, and used the lime to make a strong, white plaster. She spent days patching the cracks, filling the holes where the original chinking had crumbled away, her hands and clothes caked with mud. An old prospector named Elias Thorne, who lived a hermit's life in the hills, happened by one afternoon while she was working. He was a gnarled man with a beard like a tumbleweed, and eyes as blue and clear as the desert sky. He watched her for a long time in silence, then dismounted from his mule. "You're packing it too wet," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "It'll crack when it dries." Without another word, he knelt beside her trough, added more dry dirt and straw, and worked the mixture with his bare hands until it was the perfect consistency. He stayed for an hour, showing her how to apply it, so it would bond with the old adobe. He didn't ask about her past, or what she was doing there alone. He simply saw a job being done and offered his expertise. He became her first visitor, stopping by every few days to check her progress, often leaving a brace of rabbits or a chunk of dried venison on her doorstep without a word. With the walls sealed against the wind and the dust, she turned to the roof. This was the most daunting task. Some of the main timbers were sound, but several of the smaller crossbeams were rotted through. She used her new axe to fell a pair of slender piñon pines from a grove up the creek bed, and spent 2 grueling days trimming and shaping them with her father's saw. Getting them into place was another matter. She was struggling to hoist the first beam when Finn arrived with the livery wagon, bringing a small crate Mrs. Gable had sent. It contained jars of preserved peaches and a bolt of sturdy canvas. He saw her predicament, and without being asked, he looped a rope over a high, solid branch of a nearby cottonwood tree and helped her rig a pulley system. Together, they maneuvered the new beams into place. "My pa was a roofer," he said, by way of explanation. "You learn a few things." He stayed the rest of the day, helping her nail down new planking and seal the entire structure with a thick coat of pine pitch she had bought. When they were done, standing back to admire their work, he just nodded. "That'll hold," he said. It was the highest praise she could have imagined. Her community was not one of formal welcomes or social calls. It was a community of work, coalescing through shared skills and quiet acts of practical generosity. Elias Thorne taught her how to read the weather in the clouds. Mrs. Gable, seeing her industry, began to pay her to mend torn canvas tarps and grain sacks for the mercantile, her fine, strong stitches, a valuable commodity. Finn brought her news from town and helped her build a sturdy new door. They were a small, unlikely collection of solitary people, drawn together not by friendship, but by a mutual respect for a job well done. Each nail hammered, each bucket of plaster smoothed, was an act of creation, not just of a house, but of a life. The turning of the seasons marked Josie's own transformation. As the relentless heat of summer gave way to the crisp, cool air of autumn, the Vargas homestead was no longer a ruin. The new door, built of solid pine planks, hung straight and true on hand-forged iron hinges Finn had acquired from the blacksmith. The single pane of glass in the west-facing window caught the afternoon sun, casting a warm, golden light across the newly plastered walls. Inside, the house was sparse but clean. She had built a sturdy bed frame in one corner, a table and 2 chairs from salvaged lumber, and a set of shelves next to the hearth. The iron cook stove, once a rusted relic, had been cleaned and polished, and now it radiated a steady, comforting warmth. Esther Vargas's small carved bird sat on the mantelpiece, a silent guardian. Outside, a small but thriving garden grew in a patch of earth she had tilled and amended with rich soil from the creek bed. Rows of beans, squash, and corn stood green and healthy, a testament to the life-giving power of the once-choked well. The curse had become a punchline that Elias Thorne would deliver with a wry grin. "Cursed with sweet water and good soil," he'd rasp, sipping the strong coffee she brewed for him on his weekly visits. He would sit at her table, sharing stories of his prospecting days, his presence a quiet affirmation of her place in this wild landscape. Her relationship with the town of Saltwash had also shifted. Subtly, but profoundly. She was no longer the cast-off niece, the object of pity and suspicion. She was Josie Lane, of the Jasper Creek Homestead. When she rode into town on the mule she had purchased from Elias, people nodded to her. Mrs. Gable no longer addressed her as child, but as Josie, and would set aside the best cuts of bacon for her. The mending work she did for the mercantile had earned her a reputation for being reliable and skilled. Other townsfolk began to seek her out for small repairs. A torn leather saddlebag, a split axe handle, a wobbly chair leg. They paid her in coin or in goods, and each transaction was a thread, weaving her more deeply into the fabric of the community. She had become a part of the local economy, a person of value. Finn remained a steady presence. He would often find a reason to ride out her way, sometimes bringing a book or an old newspaper, other times just to share a comfortable silence on the new porch she and he had built. He never spoke of the future or of feelings, but his quiet companionship was a balm to the solitude that had defined so much of her life. Small rituals began to anchor her days. The morning walk to the garden to check for new growth, the rhythmic work of grinding corn for her daily bread, the evening hour spent on the porch, watching the sky bleed color over the mesas as the coyotes began their nightly chorus. This was not the life of children and laughter that Esther Vargas had once dreamed of for this house. It was a quiet life, a solitary life, but it was not a lonely one. It was a life built not from a grand design, but from the patient accumulation of small, deliberate acts. She had taken a place of ruin and memory and made it a place of purpose and life. The homestead, once a symbol of her desperation, was now the source of her strength and her dignity. It was not just a shelter, it was a home she had earned, a testament to the truth her father had taught her all those years ago. An honest cut, an honest day's work, could build a world. One evening, as the last light of a spectacular desert sunset faded to a deep, bruised purple, Josie sat on the porch steps, a cup of chamomile tea warming her hands. A cool breeze, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain, stirred the leaves of the cottonwood tree near the well. Inside, the lamp she had lit cast a welcoming, buttery glow through the clean glass of the window. The house behind her felt solid, a warm and breathing presence at her back. She was holding her father's dovetail, saw in her lap, its weight familiar and comforting. The applewood handle was so worn from her own grip and his before her that it felt like an extension of her own hand. She ran a thumb over the brass spine, thinking of him, of his quiet patience, and the simple, profound lessons he had taught her. He had given her the skill to build, to create order and strength from raw materials. On the small porch rail beside her sat the little wooden bird that Esther Vargas had left behind, its form simple and elegant. She thought of this woman she had never met, a woman whose life had echoed her own in its themes of loss and endurance. Esther had not left behind skills of joinery or carpentry, but she had provided something just as essential: the means, the hope, and the profound, unspoken understanding of one solitary heart to another. She had left a foundation of faith, a belief that someone worthy would come to inherit her lonely vigil. And then she thought of Silas. She no longer felt the sharp sting of his rejection. The anger and hurt had long since weathered away, leaving behind a kind of distant, sorrowful pity. He was a man who saw the world only in terms of profit and loss, a man who would have looked at this homestead and seen only a worthless ruin. He could never have understood the wealth that lay not in the tin box, but in the sturdy stone walls, the sweet water of the well, and the deep peace of a home built with one's own hands. He had cast her out with $20, believing he was ridding himself of a burden. He had no idea he was giving her the key to her entire world. The dovetail saw, and the carved bird sat side by side on the rail, two small objects from two different lives, one a man she had loved and lost, the other a woman she had never known. Together, they represented the twin pillars of her new life, the practical skill to build and the resilient hope to begin again. They were the tools and the testament, the craft and the courage. Josie Lane was 18 years old, and had been cast out into the desert with $20 to her name. She had spent it all on the filing fee for a cursed and abandoned claim, the old Vargas homestead on Jasper Creek. It was the best $20 she ever spent. The land had not swallowed her hope. It had given it roots. The house had not been a tomb, but a seed. It had only been waiting for someone, with the eyes to see its value, and the hands to bring it back to life. She looked out at the vast, star-dusted canopy of the desert sky, a territory that was no longer frightening or empty, but was now simply the view from her own front porch. She was home. If Josie's story of finding shelter and strength in a forgotten place moved you, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that new beginnings are always possible, often where we least expect them. And we'd love to hear from you in the comments. What is one skill you possess, taught to you by someone you admire, that could help you rebuild your own world if you ever needed to? Thank you for spending this time with us.